Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Robinson, and I'm the editor of Spud Smart. Today, I'll be serving as your host for this webinar. Today's theme is keeping your fields free of unwanted potatoes. I'd like to take a minute to thank BASF and McCain for partnering with us on this Roundtable series webinar. Today's presenters are Gavin Graham, who is the Weed Management Specialist and Provincial Minor Use Coordinator with the New Brunswick Department of Agriculture, Aquaculture, and Fisheries. And then our second presenter is Erin Burns, who is a Weed Science Extension Specialist and Assistant Professor in the Department of Plant, Soil, and Microbial Sciences at Michigan State University. In today's webinar, you'll learn about study results on volunteer potato control, best practices for controlling these unwanted visitors, and what herbicides are available for control of them. During the presentation, you'll likely have some questions for our speakers. Please type these into the chat box at any time during the webinar, and we'll address them during the question and answer session after the presentations. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available at spudsmart.com following this live event. Our first presenter is Gavin Graham, who, as said before, is the Weed Management Specialist and Provincial Minor Use Coordinator with the New Brunswick Department of Agriculture, Aquaculture, and Fisheries. Gavin grew up on a mixed farm in Saskatchewan and completed his master's in plant sciences from the University of Saskatchewan. He has an active weed research extension program for New Brunswick farmers with a focus on wild blueberry production. He is an active member in both the New Brunswick Institute of Agrologists and the Canadian Weed Science Society. Take it away, please, Gavin.
Great. Thanks for the introduction. As was mentioned, my name's Gavin Graham. I'm the Weed Management Specialist here in New Brunswick. And today I'm going to be talking about volunteer potato management. If you got any questions, feel free to put them into the chat for discussion later on, or else reach out directly afterwards after the presentation too. So as far as volunteers go, it's really impossible to remove all the tubers during our harvest procedures, depending on your size profile or what your crop's looking like. Some estimates are that you can leave up to 10% of those tubers in the field. So those tubers are going to stay in the field and could potentially sprout in the next season and become weeds or act as weeds in your following rotation years, and even give direct competition for that next crop, or else act as an alternate host for some of the other pests or diseases that we're dealing with in potato production. So this can, act as a bridge to spread these issues around and help them spread within the fields or within our landscape. So it is important to try to look at control. If you do leave those volunteers grow for that full cycle or that full season, they can produce those daughter tubers, and then your cycle will just keep on repeating. So it is important to try to manage those ones when you first see them, and try to limit their spread and limit their potential to give you impacts later on down the road. So volunteer potatoes are not an easy weed to control. They can be pretty difficult depending on what your crop rotation looks like and what your following crops are. One of the issues is that these volunteers have a pretty wide emergence pattern. They tend to emerge at various times over the season, and this is really controlled by how deep those tubers are within your soil profile. So the ones that are a little bit shallower will tend to come out earlier, and if they're deeper ones, it'll take them longer to get out of the ground. It also depends a little bit on the health of those tubers that were put in there as well too. If they're smaller diseased tubers, they tend to be not as robust, but if they're kind of larger tubers or healthier tubers, then they will be a little bit more vigorous on their early growth, and then a little bit on your field conditions as well too, depending on where they are in your soil profile. The other issue is that these tubers do act as storage reserves for that weed or that volunteer plant. So they'll use those storage organs as reserves to grow back after some treatments or after some control options. So it's you will expect to see multiple flushes or regrowth following some treatments as well. They are also very vigorous and very can be a problem that way as well too. That they are pretty robust weed, and they can be difficult to control because of that. So as far as management goes, there's no real single one management tactic or technique that's going to work for everyone. you really need to integrate multiple strategies to try to get ahead of these weed species. And prevention is really the cornerstone of any kind of volunteer potato management program. Anytime that you can stop the problem before it becomes a problem, you're going to be better off in the long run. So as far as the agronomic practices that you can look at in your potato year, for best volunteer management, any tuber that you put in the storage is better than any tuber that you leave in the field. So the more tubers that you're able to take and remove from the field, the better off you're going to be when it comes to a volunteer situation. That could have some impacts on your pack out or contracts and that kind of stuff. So there is some balancing to do there. But from a volunteer perspective, taking more potatoes out of the field, the better you're going to be. And to be able to do that, that's where you need to have any practices to ensure a uniform, properly sized crop so that you're able to get the most out of the field as possible. So that comes down to your seed spacing, seed management, making sure that you've got a healthy seed stock, putting the right fertility there for the size profile that you're looking for, reducing the disease impacts. But ultimately, a lot of it's up to Mother Nature. And as we've seen here in Eastern Canada this past season, some dry conditions can really impact that size profile and make it a little bit difficult to do that job properly. So as far as when you get into the actual harvest of your potato crop, making sure that your harvester settings and speeds are set correctly, trying to make sure that you're maximizing the amount of product that goes back into the bin and into the storage, avoiding spills in the field, making sure that your tubers have fully removed from the stems so that you're not, they're not getting caught on the vines and going through your harvester that way. And that's where making a proper desiccant choice, if required, is important. And then the other option is in-field sprout inhibitor. We've really gotten away from that, but it is something to consider if your markets will allow that, or if your practices will allow for that in-field sprout inhibitor. But really, when it comes to volunteer management, we are really relying on our winter conditions. The best thing for volunteer management is just to hope for that cold. If you look at the literature, there's mention of about 50 chilling hours at -2 degrees Celsius is the requirement to stop those volunteers. And you need to get that temperature at the tuber level. So if the tuber is sitting at the top, it's a little easier to get that cold. If it's buried within your soil profile, it takes a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder to get it there, and that's where that depth of burial or depth of the tuber within your soil comes into play. And then the other factor that comes into play there is the amount of snow cover that you see. For us here in New Brunswick, we typically see more of those volunteers along those windbreaks or along where the snow is going to gather and kind of insulate the soil. So that's something to keep in mind if you're scouting fields later on. Pay particular attention to where the snow was covered if you're worried about soil temperatures. So this is just a quick snapshot of some information on soil temperatures. The colorful picture is from the Cornell site, basically just outlining some temperatures at 2-inch. It was actually from last winter, but just shows that depending on where you are and the time of year that you're looking at it, you can get some variability on that soil temperature. And then the picture on the left-hand side there, or the graph on the left-hand side, just outlines the difference in temperature that you can see in the soil based on where in that soil profile you're taking that temperature. So if you're close to the soil surface, typically you get a much colder temperatures there. But as you go deeper into the soil profile, the temperature is a little bit warmer, and those potatoes are a little bit more insulated there. So depending on where those tubers are in the soil profile will depend on how well they're able to overwinter or how much exposure they get to that -2 temperature. So this is where tillage comes into play. So if you're looking at tillage after harvest, you really want to try to leave those tubers at the top of the soil surface as much as possible, just so that they have the best chance of exposure to those colder temperatures. And then you don't have to worry about managing those tubers in the future. If you had a smaller size profile, or if you had some issues with harvesting, that's the time to maybe for sure to try to avoid that tillage if your volunteer risk is high. just because if you are doing that tillage, you put them into the soil, your risk of being able to get that chilling temperature is not going to be there. Some things to get around this: if you do need to do some tillage, you could look at some spot tillage, or look at your volunteer risk and then make the decision on how you're going to be able to manage that. As far as tillage, when you get into your rotational years or outside of that kind of potato season, those tillage there can help exhaust those tuber reserves, depending on the timing. If the tubers do have some pretty good reserves, so you may have to look at multiple passes to be able to get that done. And then if you are able to do some tillage in crop, that can help reduce daughter tuber production. So if you are seeing issues, if you're growing some wider row crops, some tillage in between those rows might be able to help you. So some of the other options to consider is some cultural controls in your rotational crop. Once again, similar to the message on the potato years, just to make sure you got a competitive crop using sound agronomic methods, trying to get that crop to be as competitive as it can be against those volunteers. Depending on your situation, you could look at delaying your plantings or avoiding underseeding grain could be another option, just to give you a few different options or better toolbox as far as herbicide control. But it depends on your rotational situation, and honestly, I think the differences from location to location across Canada is really going to be driving that. Some of the biological options, you always see Colorado potato beetles feeding on those volunteers to reduce survivability. But honestly, that's something that we're kind of looking at control to avoid those things. So it is something to keep in mind, though, that it is a potential option. And for the rest of the presentation, at least in my portion here, I'll cover off some of the herbicide options and outline one specific trial that I had performed. So basically, we here in New Brunswick, we did try to chase volunteer potato control for quite a few seasons. We were really focused in on trying to get control within our grain crop, because that's typically where our volunteer issues are the greatest, or that's where our options are maybe the greatest, and we need a little bit more information there. I did try to get trials out on some overwintering populations, so going out and trying to find field areas that had good natural volunteers and try to control them that way. And we also tried to put some potato seed in some cereal stands and try to mimic what a volunteer would be. But in both of those approaches, we really didn't get consistent emergence of the volunteers. Pretty variable, and I wasn't really confident in the results that we're getting. It just wasn't as consistent as I would like to see. And then the other thing that we were not really looking for in those kinds of situations is that we were not going back to those volunteers to see how many daughter tubers those were producing and how these different treatment impact or were changing the daughter tuber production out of these treatments. So basically, we kind of went back to the drawing board and decided to put out a trial basically in a commercial planting kind of situation. The variety that we used was Russet Burbank, just because that's the most common one that we grow here. This situation may not be similar to what the volunteer situation would be in your rotational crops. This is pretty vigorous seed, given the best chance for survival, doing the best job of emergence and all that. And we don't have the added impacts of crop competition on these plants either. They're basically just competing with themselves. So they are pretty vigorous and pretty active growth. But I think it was a good representation of kind of the worst case scenario and gave us a chance to evaluate these products on some different at a kind of the worst case scenario. And then we can maybe make some inferences to our commercial production after that. So the image at the right-hand side of the slide there is the stage that the applications of these different treatments went on at. So a little bit variable in the sizing of the potatoes, but I would think that would be pretty similar to what you would see in a volunteer situation within a field, potentially maybe even a little bit later than you'd like to see for these applications. But like I mentioned earlier, it is quite variable on the emergence there. So I'm going to have this consistency along the bottom of the slide here as far as when I get into the different herbicide treatments. So basically different pictures from each of these different plot areas: 7 days, 15 days, 23 days, and 36 days after application. So that progression will be the same for each of the different herbicide treatments. And then the final picture will be a visual representation of what the tubers, the daughter tubers that were harvested from these plots look like and the unit there is going to be kilograms of tubers within the row. And then the numbers at the top is percent control above any of the day ratings there. So moving into the results, you can see the untreated area, normal growth of the potato crop. Basically, the flowers were starting to show up on that 15-day after application rating, but you can see, no injury showing up there. And the 24 kilograms is the number to keep in mind as kind of the worst case scenario for the tuber production. If we look at Roundup applied at the 900 grams of active ingredient per hectare rate, this was the best overall treatment in the trial that I had here. You can see the visual control was pretty consistent throughout the early season, but we were starting to see a little bit of regrowth coming at that 36-day after application, but a pretty significant impact on that daughter tuber production. So a real good reduction in the daughter tuber numbers. And you can even see some seed piece effects. So that's the top right-hand picture there. So that was one of the seed pieces from the planting that we had there. You can see the glyphosate was getting down to the tuber and getting some good control that way. The next treatment we looked at was Callisto. Callisto is one that we're using more in corn production, but we wanted to have a look at it just because there was good volunteer control recommendations for it from other regions. And you can see pretty strong visual symptoms there. Maybe a little bit slower than what the glyphosate was, but pretty significant there if you're looking at the 23-day after. But the potatoes did recover from these treatments though. The top picture is a 56-day after application picture. So it's looking like almost a complete potato canopy by the end of the season. But we did have that strong yield impact, an 80% reduction in those daughter tuber yields. So this would be a pretty strong treatment to look at. So shifting over to more of our kind of typical cereal herbicides, the first one we looked at here was MCPA at a low application rate is what I'm saying, but this is would be kind of the standard rate that we'd be using here in New Brunswick, or even trending towards a little bit on the high side actually for what we'd be typically seeing in our cereal production. You can see the MCPA did slow down the volunteers a little bit on those first few ratings, but they did catch up by the end of the season, and no yield reduction at the end of the day. So the MCPA really didn't help us in our volunteer control situation. If we up the application rate, we did improve things slightly, but really not enough to justify that higher use rate. And the rate that we're using at this high rate was getting towards the top end of the label, and I think the risk of crop injury to your cereal crop would be too high to even bother with this one. So I think bumping up our MCPA rate isn't going to be the solution for volunteer management. One of the newer ones we looked at was Trophy. It did improve things over MCPA amine applied alone. We did see a bit of a reduction in yield, but the label here is pretty narrow for us here in Eastern Canada, at least anyway. Western Canada might have a little bit more flexibility over using this one, but a decent, visual reduction in plant cover. But by the end of the season, we were still getting quite a few volunteer tubers being set. Pixaro is another one of the newer ones. A little bit better on the suppression earlier on after application, but the potatoes did come back, and then the yield was decreased slightly, but still not to a very high level. Infinity had really good visual symptoms very early on after application. If you look at these images, first off, they look pretty similar to those Callisto slides, and that is because they have that similar, or one component in Infinity is the same mode of action as what Callisto would be. So you see that bleaching symptom, but there was a pretty quick recovery. It did recover a little bit faster than what those Callisto treatments were. But we were still getting a fairly decent yield effect on those daughter tubers of 40% yield reduction there. Looking at Refine Extra, or Refine Extra is the name that we're calling it back when we were putting out this trial. We had very good suppression with Refine early on in the season, 70% control on those earlier timings, but we did see some regrowth there as well too. The tubers, yield-wise, fairly strong reduction, One thing we noticed with the refine is that we did increase our number of tubers that we were harvesting, but they were smaller tubers. So that's something to keep in mind, that the refine treatment did change our size profile a little bit. If we went through and added the MCPA to refine, which is one of the standard treatments that we use for a lot of our production acres here, it did offer a bit of an improvement over the refine by itself, but not strong enough to really justify the addition. If you're looking at different weed species or looking for that full package of weed control, maybe adding the MCPA to the refine would help you out there. So just to have a little bit of a conclusion on the herbicide treatments that we put out there, Roundup was the best treatment for visual control and daughter tuber yield. So I think Roundup is the strongest option that we had in the trial. Callisto had some regrowth, but there was some good control of daughter tubers. So for corn production or some of the other crops that Callisto has a label for, I think this is a good option. MCPA amine alone was not really effective. Moving over to Pixaro and Trophy did improve visual suppression, but they didn't really improve the final tuber yields. But the strongest ones, as far as the cereal perspective, Infinity, Refine, and Refine plus MCPA, were the best as far as suppression goes, but a little bit more reduction in tuber yields. But honestly, any of the grain herbicides were not as strong as the Roundup or the Callisto within the trial. So just to wrap up, as far as the discussion goes, I think if you had these volunteers in a crop situation, if you're growing these in a pretty competitive cereal crop, I think our control levels would have improved, and maybe some of these conclusions would have been a little bit stronger for some of these herbicide options. So that's something to keep in mind. We had Chieftain Spacers, so we put Chieftains kind of to signify the ends of the plots, having the reds when we were harvesting. These spacers did behave differently for some of the different products. Pixaro is the one that we noticed the most, that Pixaro is really controlling the Chieftains much better than the Russet Burbanks. So there might be a variety impact that's happening in here. So that's something else to keep in mind. And then honestly, I think the best measures from the trial is just to spray before the volunteers get too large. As you're dealing with larger and larger plants, they are harder to control. So with that, I know there was one mention about grabbing the email address. It is up there again, so if you want to jot that down. But feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat, and we can answer those questions later on, or else reach out to me at the email address or the phone number that's listed there if you want to talk to me throughout the season as well too. So thanks everyone for your time, and look forward to the question session later on.
Thanks so much, Gavin. Good job. And as he said, remember, if you have any questions for Gavin or Erin right away, please type those into the chat box at any time during the webinar, and we'll address them during the question and answer session after the presentations. Our next presenter is Erin Burns, who is a weed science extension specialist and assistant professor in the Department of Plant, Soil, and Microbial Sciences at Michigan State University. Erin started at Michigan State in April 2017. She received her Bachelor of Science degree from the College of St. Benedict, which is in Minnesota, in biology, her Master of Science degree from North Dakota State University in Plant Sciences, and her PhD from Montana State University in Plant Sciences. Erin's research and extension program focuses on current and emerging problematic weeds in Michigan cropping systems, specifically forages, potatoes, corn, and recently industrial hemp. Current research focuses on practices to mitigate the development and spread of herbicide-resistant weeds and understanding. Thanks to Erin, and please take it away.
Awesome. Thanks for that introduction, and for everyone joining here today. And so we're going to switch gears and talk about volunteer potato management in corn, because that's often the phase, at least here in Michigan, that we see it being probably the most problematic, and that I get the most questions about for control. So that's where we really focus some of our trial work. And as you previously learned through Gavin's discussion, volunteer potatoes are difficult to control. They're a beast within themselves, with having that huge storage reserve compared to some of the other weed species, which much smaller seeds. And that they just have that ability to grow quite quickly and be quite damaging to the crop that you're competing with. And then specifically in corn and in many other cropping systems, there are no herbicides available that will both completely control the volunteers, But ultimately, the goal is to reduce that number of daughter tubers that are produced, because that is, as mentioned previously, can continue that cycle and either be problematic then to your next potato phase or whatever your next cropping system is. And that volunteer potatoes may become more problematic in the future, given that we're starting to have much more mild winters here, especially in Michigan. We've relied on our cold weather to kill some of these volunteers, and that's just not happening anymore. So they may become more problematic in the future if you don't have that problem yet. So studies at MSU have shown that most potato cultivars that we grow here in Michigan break down after about a day of exposure to either 27 degrees Fahrenheit, or which is negative 2.8 Celsius, and that's about for a day, give or take a few hours. So what we've done is there is a potato monitoring site that you can visit. We can put that in the chat box later too. That will give the predicts if you'll have volunteer trouble or not, based off of soil temperatures from November to March 31st. So you can see that on the screen is a snapshot of this with the state of Michigan and then the locations in which we've had studies and looking at these soil temperatures. And what it does is gives you the number of hours either above or below 27 degrees Fahrenheit and at different soil depths. So at 2 inches and then at 4 inches, which is a little bit more difficult to get that cold. And then it gives you a risk in a red, yellow, or green. So the green would be low risk, meaning that we did achieve greater than 120 hours during this time frame below our threshold of 27 or negative 2.8. And moderate would be you achieve that at 2 inches, but not at 4 inches. So that might mean that that cold temperature has killed off that top layer of volunteers, but those that are insulated deeper into the soil would still continue to grow and could be problematic the following season. And high temp, the high risk is if you did not achieve that threshold at either of your soil depths. And this is what we're starting to see be much more consistent here throughout the state of Michigan. And definitely the past few years, we have had larger volunteer issues than in years past. So the trial that we conducted at MSU focused on herbicides that you can use in corn production. And these are all HPPD inhibitors. So the site of action group number is group 27. So when you're looking on those herbicide labels, anything that had a 27 that was labeled for corn here in Michigan is what we tried to try out. So we used on this table on your screen, we have the trade names, and then in the blue is the active ingredient name. I just included those in case some of these trade names are different between the US and Canada, but I think the majority of them are pretty much similar. And then the rates, both in fluid ounces and in liters, and then the additives that we needed to put in with those. So COC stands for crop oil concentrate, AMS, and then MSO is methylated seed oil, or NIS is non-ionic surfactant. And those are important to add in with these herbicides to ensure that we could get both thorough coverage of our volunteer potatoes when we're applying that herbicide, and trying to make sure that those herbicides can penetrate that leaf layer and get into the plant as quickly as possible so that they can do their job at controlling those volunteers. And then what we looked at was if we could add atrazine in with some of these herbicide combinations, because with many of these HPPD inhibitors, there's literature that shows that you can add in atrazine. We used a half pound. You can get some synergistic impacts, which all that means is that you get greater control than if you just use one of those herbicides alone. So that was the next set of treatments, was looking at those two combinations. And similar to Gavin, we tried to track down natural populations of volunteers for a handful of years, and I just couldn't find a good, heavy population that was evenly distributed throughout the field that was large enough for us to put our trial into. So what we did was we made our own volunteer population, and to do that, we took leftover seed pieces. We used the variety Snowden, which is a common chipping variety that we use here in Michigan. And we ensured that the seed pieces were all different sizes to reflect different initial size of tubers that you would be trying to control. And then what we did is we just walked this plot with baskets and we were shaking them, just randomly distributing these seed pieces. And then we ran different levels of tillage equipment across the field, and then ultimately cultipacked it with the goal that we would be burying those seed pieces at various depths to simulate what you would be trying to control in your own field. So hopefully planting some a little bit deeper to get delayed emergence, and then having some that were at the soil surface, so that ultimately the goal was to have a variety of size profiles. And then when we went to go apply our herbicide application, which you can see on the right-hand side of your screen, that's the picture of the field that we used. And what we did is we went in and flagged individual plants that were 6 inches, 12 inches, or 24 inches tall, and then followed how well these herbicides controlled those plants at each size profile to give you an idea of what might be effective on small volunteers and what might be effective on taller volunteers, in case that's what you're trying to control in your field. And these are just visual pictures. These are about 35 days after herbicide application. We went and dug the plants and then just took some photos to give visuals of what they looked like. So on the left-hand side of your screen is Callisto alone, fairly good at controlling 6-inch volunteers. It's very hard to see. There's a tiny dried up plant on that picture with no daughter tubers that were produced. 12 inches, we do have 1 or 2 daughter tubers that were produced. We had fairly good top growth control. And then if we waited to 24 inches, that was just too large for a Callisto application, in which we did have some daughter tubers that were produced. And then if we were able to make that application with atrazine, now regardless of our size, we were fairly effective at both controlling top growth and then ultimately reducing the daughter tubers that were being produced, and with only one very small one on that very largest size class. Next category was with Parmesan or Impact. And this was not as successful as our Callisto applications. On the left is just those herbicides alone, in which regardless of our size, we did start to see some daughter tubers being produced. And also you can see that foliage is fairly healthy and green and bounced back pretty well from this herbicide application. And then if we did add atrazine, we do see a slight improvement on our small and medium-sized volunteers, but really no impact once we got up to our largest size class. Next herbicide treatment was Lotus. Lotus was fairly successful at controlling the smallest volunteers. We did have a slight reduction at the 12-inch and then pretty much no impact at 24. But similar to other results, if we were able to add in that atrazine, now at 6, 12, and 24, we've really started to see a pretty good reduction in daughter tuber formation. We also evaluated Acuron Flexi, and that's 6 inches, pretty good control. 12 inches, we did have some top growth, regrowth, but we did see a reduction in daughter tubers. And at 24 inches, pretty good control for that size, and probably the best herbicide we evaluated on those fairly large volunteers, but still quite a few, a bit smaller daughter tubers, but they were still there. And then if we added atrazine now, we see a pretty consistent control across the board, regardless of size, and able to reduce the number of daughter tubers that were ultimately produced. Final herbicide we evaluated was Shield-X, similar story to the others, fairly good at 6 inches. Once you get a little bit larger, we start to see reductions in control and ultimately no impact on those daughter tubers being produced. So the next slides we're going to go over are a few data slides just to back up what some of these visuals are, but I like to show the visuals as I think they're a good way to look at how hard some of these larger volunteers can be to control with just a variety of herbicides. So the figure on your screen is now looking at, we counted the number of tubers per plant, and we wanted to see did we actually have an impact on the number that were being produced. And we have our different herbicide treatments labeled across the horizontal axis on your screen. And then the different bars are our size classes. So green would be small, gray, medium, and the black is tall. So those are greater than 12 inches when we apply that herbicide. And the first batches are untreated. So we had no herbicide. So you can look at that as your reference point. And then the blue line I just put as a 1 tuber per plant threshold as a goal that we were trying to see if we could reduce any tuber production possible. And what we found is when we were able to apply those herbicides to small volunteers, about 60% of our treatments resulted in 1 or no daughter tubers being produced. So you can look at treatments of Callisto plus atrazine, Lotus plus atrazine, our Acuron Flexi plus or minus atrazine treatments are fairly good at controlling these plants and also reducing that tuber production. But when we sprayed larger ones, so 6 to 12 inches or greater than 12 inches, we had 25% control of those mediums, and then no treatments that were successful at controlling tubers or controlling daughter tuber production when we were making those herbicide applications to large volunteers. So this is general, which Gavin found also in his studies. These larger volunteers are just much more difficult to control than our smaller volunteers. And then we actually weighed each one of those tubers. So maybe we still had tubers being produced, but they were quite small. So we know if the smaller ones, less root or less storage reserves in those tubers to then have to overwinter again and be problematic the following season. And we did see a very similar trend. Once again, the smaller volunteers that we had, the tubers they produced were also smaller. So at the end of the day, when we're trying to control some pretty heavy populations, if we can get in and apply those herbicides when they're smaller, that's when we start to see more successful herbicide applications. So some conclusions from the studies we conducted in corn is that overall the addition of atrazine to these HPPD inhibitors, those group 27s, across the board improved volunteer potato control. As the size of volunteer potatoes increased, our ultimate control decreased. And then also keep in mind, the study was without any kind of crop competition. So once again, probably reflecting more of a worst case scenario when you're not relying on that crop competition to provide some volunteer control also. And then ultimately what you're going to apply to control volunteers, you need to keep in mind what your future crop rotations are to make sure that you're staying within those rotation restrictions. And in general, some very general conclusions, highlighting what Gavin went over and what we found also was that if you can prevent the problem at the first place, that's your best bet at controlling these guys. So sound agronomic practices, harvest management, making sure you're getting as much out of the field as possible and not leaving any tubers behind. The tillage practices, so if you can keep those tubers at the soil surface, that's going to maximize your winter kill. Also, then you're not dealing with that staggered emergence when they're all kind of at the same soil profile. You'll get a more even flush, and then you can apply those herbicides all to smaller plants. And then ultimately, crop rotation will help you in controlling your volunteers overall. So planting time, we can plant crops a little bit later, depending on what specific species that is, and you can control those prior to planting. And then ultimately considering planting grass crops, as you have a lot more herbicide options to control these broadleaf volunteer potatoes than what you do in broadleaf crops. And with that, I just have our website, which is msuweeds.com. That's where we put up all of our weed science research. You can find this study on there, and then my email and phone number if you have questions in the future outside of the question and answer session that we're going to go into next.
Thanks so much, Erin. Great job. I'd now like to do a short question and answer session. And if you have any questions for either of our presenters that you haven't typed in yet, please type it into the chat box now. And so our first question comes from Guy Madison, and he asks, how viable were the daughter tubers the following spring in producing potato plants? And I think he had asked this just after Gavin's presentation. So let's start with Gavin. What would you like to say about that?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. It's something that we didn't look at in our trial. We didn't take those tubers and plant them the next year to see if there was any difference in viability. Just from the looks of the tubers for most of the cereal ones, at least anyway, they were looking to be in pretty decent shape and pretty robust looking tubers. So I think that there wouldn't be much of an impact, but we didn't plant them, so we don't know for sure.
Erin, do you have anything you'd like to add from your side?
We also did not follow up and plant those the following spring, and similar, ours were quite healthy looking, very, very little growth cracking or anything like that I would predict would have impacts the following year.
Thank you. And we have another question from Guy. I think this one might kind of fall into what you guys just said, but I'll ask it just in case. How viable were the daughter tubers the following spring when compared to different sprays that were trialed in Gavin's trial with the different herbicides? Gavin, please.
Yeah, no, I think we kind of covered that in the last question there. That I don't think that we didn't do the full look at the next year to plant them back out, but I would be, if I was guessing, they would be pretty robust.
Thanks, Gavin. Okay, and we're going to move on to our next question. And this one is from Anders Anderson. And he asked, this is definitely towards Erin. He asked, do you really use atrazine in the US? It is causing a lot of problems in Europe.
So yes, the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, is who does a lot of our herbicide labels, and they have different rules that they go through when herbicides go up for reevaluation and things like that. So the herbicides we do use are all approved for use, and we follow the label. So you definitely would want to make sure that you're following your specific country and regions recommendations for herbicide uses there. But we do still use those here, and it's also dependent on soil types. So we're not spraying those on soil types where you can have issues with ground bleaching and things like that. So they're used in certain scenarios according to the label.
And I know that was a question that was specifically US, but Gavin, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, no, just from a Canadian perspective, like we do have, a similar answer there that PMRA does look at the health and safety and environmental impacts of all these chemicals, and it's still a registered treatment from their perspective, but Quebec is one that they are looking at some different restrictions provincially around atrazine. So it's something just to keep in mind that you need to be careful or look at the province that you're growing in and make sure you're following the rules that apply there.
Thank you. And our next question is from Michael Murphy. And this is for both of you. Have either presenters looked at cover crops to suppress volunteers? If so, what are the best ones to plant? How about we start with you, Gavin?
Yeah, so I haven't looked at anything specifically on cover crops for volunteer potato management, but just kind of some general comments. I think anything that you're looking to plant that would be competitive against other weed species like your buckwheats or anything like that, I think would be more competitive with that. But as we're looking at cover crops or service crops, I think we have the potential to maybe delay our seedings or come back in and mow them down afterwards or those kinds of things. So there are some different opportunities if we are looking at cover crops, just because maybe we're not looking at eventual harvest in a longer season, that we can shorten up that season a little bit and give us some different volunteer potato control opportunities. So I think it's something that we can look at a little bit more, and from depending on how it fits into your individual grower system, I think that's the biggest thing to look at.
Thank you. And Erin, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't directly looked at cover crops and volunteer control, but I think anything that you can establish, if you're going in for volunteers, so after potatoes that you can get established in the fall, and then that won't winter kill, so species that can grow and sustain throughout the winter and then resume growth early in the spring, because you need that really heavy cover crop biomass to start to see any kind of weed control in general. So I think you need that here too to start to see any kind of benefits.
Thank you. And this is more of a comment, but I was wondering if you guys might have anything to say about it. It comes from Robert Thornton. And his comment here is the response to different chemicals by different size plants would require multiple applications, as tubers of different depth would produce tubers of different size at different times. Erin, do you have anything to comment on that?
Yeah, it's that you hit it on the head. That's what makes volunteers really difficult to control, is because of this staggered emergence patterns, that some of those that are deeper, and if the seed piece was, or the tuber was large enough, can still emerge later in the season. So that goes back into those sound agronomic practice at harvest, so making sure, and tillage implications, that you're keeping those all as close to the soil surface as possible, so that you can attempt to have apply those herbicides to more uniformly sized plants, and the smaller the better, and then go from there. But that's why they're kind of a different beast in themselves to control.
Thank you, Erin. Gavin, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, it would be a similar response on my end as well too. Like, I think it depends on what crop you're coming back with as well too. You know, something like corn or soybeans, maybe you have a little bit more flexibility as far as multiple applications of a herbicide within one season. But if you're looking at cereal production, where basically we've got one weed control shot, you do need to make sure you're timing that one kind of correctly. So it is a bit of a guessing game. So, I think you do have to have a look at your fields and what you're overwintering, your potential for volunteers was as well too. If you're just starting to see stuff coming out of the ground, maybe you do need to hold off a little bit, but it is a little bit of ground truthing within individual fields as well too, just to make sure that you're covering things the right way.
Okay, thanks, guys. Well, that's all we have time for today. So I'd like to once again thank our speakers, Gavin and Erin, for joining us. You guys both did an amazing job. And once again, I would love to thank our sponsors, BASF and McCain, for making this webinar possible. And a big thank you goes out to everyone for participating. I hope you have found this information valuable. Again, a recording of this webinar will be made available on spudsmart.com. Thanks again, and we hope you have a wonderful day.